The Lost Gospel of Andrew, the first disciple's hidden story. So, there is a name that appears at the very beginning of everything. Before the sermons on the hillside. Before the miracles along the shore of Galilee. Before the crowds gathered in their thousands to hear a voice unlike any other. Before the betrayal in the garden. Before the cross. Before the empty tomb that changed the world forever. Before all of it, there was a man standing at the edge of the water, pulling a net from the cold depths of the Sea of Galilee. His name was Andrew. And in almost every account we have of the earliest days of Jesus of Nazareth, Andrew is there. He is the first. He is present at the beginning, watching, listening, believing before almost anyone else dared to believe. He crosses the threshold from ordinary life into something so vast and so transformative that the world would never be the same. And yet, if you were to read through the four Gospels carefully, something strange begins to emerge. Something that historians and biblical scholars have noticed for centuries, and that no one has ever been able to fully explain. Andrew disappears. Not entirely. Not from every page. But for a man who was there at the very beginning, for a disciple who walked with Jesus from those earliest days on the shore of Galilee, who was present for the first miracles and the first teachings, Andrew's voice is almost completely silent in the canonical scriptures. His actions are mentioned briefly. His name appears in lists. He stands in the background of several scenes. And then, for long stretches of the most important narrative in human history, he is simply gone. No long speeches. No prominent role in the great events. No recorded teachings. No prayers. No moments of revelation that bear his name. Just silence. For centuries, this silence was accepted without question. Andrew was an apostle. He followed Jesus. He was there. What more needed to be said? But then historians began to look closer. They began to ask questions that had never been asked quite so directly before. They started examining the ancient sources not just for what they said, but for what they conspicuously failed to say. They looked at the oral traditions that circulated through the earliest Christian communities. They examined texts that were never included in the Bible. They traced the footprints of a man who had walked through one of the most significant moments in human history and then, somehow, had nearly vanished from the record of it. If stories like this fascinate you, the hidden people behind history's biggest moments, take a moment to subscribe. Because some of the most important stories ever told are the ones history almost forgot. And what they found raises questions that have never been fully answered. What if Andrew left behind teachings that were never written down? What if stories about him existed in the earliest communities of believers, passed from mouth to ear, generation to generation, and then one day, somewhere along the way, those stories were simply lost? What if the silence around Andrew is not the natural silence of a man who had little to contribute, but the absence left behind by something that once existed and no longer does? This is the mystery of Andrew the Apostle. The first disciple. The man who was there before the beginning. And this is the story that history almost forgot to tell. To understand why Andrew matters, you have to go back to the world that shaped him. Not the world of miracles and resurrections and theological debate, but the ordinary, grinding, often brutal world of first-century Galilee. Galilee in the time of Jesus was not a peaceful place. It was a region under occupation, squeezed between the demands of Roman imperial power and the complex web of local politics, religious authority, and economic pressure that made daily life a constant negotiation between survival and dignity. The Roman Empire did not simply govern its provinces from a distance. It embedded itself in every aspect of life, from the taxation systems that extracted wealth from fishing communities and farming villages, to the military presence that reminded everyone at every moment who held the power of life and death. The Sea of Galilee itself was a source of livelihood for many families in the region. Fishing was not a romantic occupation in the ancient world. It was hard, physical, dangerous work. Fishermen worked through the night, dragging their heavy nets through cold water, hoping for catches that would be large enough to sustain their families, pay their taxes, and leave enough to eat. The smell of fish and salt and smoke was woven into the fabric of life along the shore. It was into this world that Andrew was born. The Gospel sources tell us very little about Andrew's early life. We know that he and his brother Simon, who would later be known as Peter, were both fishermen. We know that they came from a town called Bethsaida, though they later operated from Capernaum, a larger fishing community on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. We know that their father was named Jonah, or John, depending on which translation you follow. Beyond these few fragments, the early life of Andrew is darkness. But there is one detail that stands out, one piece of information that changes everything we might assume about the man who would become the first disciple of Jesus. Before Andrew followed Jesus, he followed someone else. The Gospel of John records a tradition that is striking in its specificity. According to this account, Andrew was first a disciple of John the Baptist. He had sought out this strange, prophetic figure who lived in the wilderness, who wore clothing made of camel's hair and ate locusts and wild honey, who preached a message of repentance and transformation so powerful that it drew people from across the region to stand in the waters of the Jordan River and be baptized. Andrew had already made one life-changing decision before Jesus appeared. He had already stepped outside the world of nets and fish and early mornings on the water, and committed himself to something larger. Something spiritual. Something that pointed toward a coming change in the world that he could feel but could not yet name. This matters more than it might initially seem. A man who had already left behind one life to follow a visionary teacher was not a man who acted impulsively. Andrew had already thought about these things. He had already wrestled with the questions that the Baptist raised. He had already made the difficult choice to believe that something was happening in the world, that something was coming, something that would require a response from every person who understood what was at stake. So when John the Baptist pointed to Jesus and said, according to the Gospel of John, "Behold the Lamb of God," Andrew was ready. He was ready in a way that most people are never ready, because he had already prepared himself through months or years of following a prophet in the desert. He had already surrendered the comfortable certainties of his old life. He had already trained himself to look beyond the surface of things and ask the deeper question. And now the deeper question had an answer. And before we go further, I'd like to ask you something. Had you ever heard that Andrew was the first person to say this? Let me know in the comments, because sometimes the most overlooked details turn out to be the most fascinating. The account in the Gospel of John is almost unbearably simple. Andrew and another disciple, believed by many scholars to be John himself, hear the Baptist's words. They follow Jesus. Jesus turns and asks them what they are looking for. They ask where he is staying. He says, "Come and see." Come and see. 3 words that changed Andrew's life. 3 words that set in motion a chain of events whose consequences would ripple through 2,000 years of human history. And then Andrew does something extraordinary. Something that reveals, perhaps better than any other single action, the nature of the man he was. He finds his brother Simon. He doesn't wait. He doesn't hold his experience close and examine it privately. He doesn't wonder whether what he has seen and heard is real. He goes immediately to the person closest to him in the world and says, "We have found the Messiah. We have found the Messiah." Andrew is the first human being in the Gospel record to make that declaration. Before Peter. Before John. Before any of the others who would later become famous for their faith and their witness. Andrew says it first. And then he brings his brother to Jesus. If you stop and think about that moment for a second, it's actually astonishing. One simple decision, one brother calling another brother, and the entire course of history quietly shifts. There's something deeply human about that scene. No grand speech. No crowd. Just a man who believes he has found something extraordinary, and the first person he thinks of is someone he loves. Think about what that means for a moment. Andrew is the first person to follow Jesus. Andrew is the first person to declare that Jesus is the Messiah. And Andrew is the bridge that brings Simon Peter into the story. Without Andrew, there is no Peter. Without Andrew's action on that day, the entire history of the church as we know it might have been different. Andrew is not just the first disciple. He is the catalyst for everything that follows. So why does he almost disappear from the story? This is the question that haunts every serious reading of the Gospel accounts. It is a question that ancient writers noticed and tried to explain, sometimes convincingly and sometimes not. It is a question that has driven scholars to examine the earliest Christian sources with increasing intensity, looking for traces of a tradition about Andrew that might have survived outside the canonical texts. What they found there is remarkable. And this is where the story becomes even more intriguing. Because when historians look at the gaps in the record, they don't just see missing information. They see clues. Silences that hint at traditions that once circulated freely among early believers but slowly faded as centuries passed. Sometimes what history leaves out can be just as revealing as what it preserves. In the Eastern churches, a tradition developed very early that Andrew was not merely a minor figure in the background of the gospel story. In the Orthodox Christian world, Andrew holds a place of supreme importance. He is called the Protokletos, the first called. He is considered the founder of the church in Constantinople, the great Christian capital that would eventually become the spiritual center of Eastern Christianity. His relics were venerated with extraordinary devotion. His feast day was among the most important in the liturgical calendar. But there was more. There were stories about Andrew that circulated through the ancient world, stories that had never been collected into a single authoritative document, stories that appeared in fragments and references and allusions scattered across texts from the early centuries of the church. Stories that suggested Andrew had done extraordinary things. Stories that pointed toward a ministry far larger and far more dangerous than anything the canonical Gospels record. Stories that raised the possibility that somewhere, in some community, in some collection of manuscripts that has either been lost or hidden or destroyed, there existed a much more complete account of what Andrew saw and heard and taught. Before we continue, take a moment to like the video if this story is opening new perspectives for you. It really helps these kinds of historical stories reach more people. The search for that account has been going on for centuries. And it has not yet found its final answer. To understand the world that Andrew moved through after the death and resurrection of Jesus, you need to understand something about the nature of the Roman Empire in the first century. Not the Rome of gladiators and colosseums, though that Rome existed too, but the Rome of roads and networks, of communication systems and military logistics, of provincial administrators and local power structures that shaped the daily reality of everyone who lived within its borders. The Roman Empire at the time of Jesus was roughly 60 to 70 million people spread across an enormous geographic area stretching from Britain in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the east, from the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north to the deserts of North Africa in the south. It was held together not primarily by force, though force was always available, but by systems. Roads that connected cities across thousands of miles. A common language of commerce and administration in Greek and Latin. Legal structures that provided a framework for daily life. Economic networks that moved goods and money across the ancient world with remarkable efficiency. For the earliest disciples of Jesus, this infrastructure was both a danger and an opportunity. It was a danger because Rome was deeply suspicious of new religious movements, especially those that claimed political implications or gathered followers across ethnic and social lines in ways that could threaten the established order. The execution of Jesus himself was a Roman act, authorized by a Roman governor, carried out by Roman soldiers. The earliest followers of Jesus existed under the constant shadow of that fact. At any moment, in any city, the arrival of the wrong official with the wrong information could mean arrest, trial, imprisonment, or death. But the same roads that carried Roman soldiers also carried merchants and travelers and pilgrims and letters. The same networks that allowed Rome to monitor its provinces also allowed the earliest Christians to communicate across vast distances, to share texts and teachings and news of new communities forming in distant cities, to travel from Jerusalem to Antioch to Corinth to Rome with a speed and safety that would not have been possible in earlier centuries. Andrew moved through this world. He walked its roads. He sailed its seas. He entered its cities and found his way to the synagogues and markets and private homes where people gathered to hear something new. And according to traditions that reach back to the earliest centuries of the church, he went very far indeed. The tradition that Andrew traveled to Scythia is recorded by Origen of Alexandria, one of the most important Christian scholars of the early 3rd century. Origen mentions, almost in passing, that the Scythians received the gospel from Andrew. Scythia was a vast region north and east of the Black Sea, the territory of nomadic peoples who lived on the steppes of what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. It was, by the standards of the Roman world, the very edge of the known world. What would it have meant to carry the message of Jesus to Scythia? It would have meant traveling across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. It would have meant crossing from the world of Greek cities and Roman infrastructure into something completely different. It would have meant learning to communicate with people who lived by different customs, spoke different languages, understood the world through different frameworks. It would have meant going where almost no one else was willing to go. Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in the early 4th century and drawing on earlier sources, expands on this tradition. According to Eusebius, Andrew's missionary territory included Scythia, but also regions of Asia Minor and Greece. Other early Christian sources add Byzantium, the city that would later become Constantinople, to the list of places where Andrew taught and established communities of believers. These are not small territories. Taken together, they represent an enormous geographic area, a ministry of remarkable scope and ambition. A man who traveled all these places, who taught in all these communities, who established churches in all these regions, would have had stories to tell. Would have had encounters to describe. Would have had experiences that shaped his understanding of the teaching he had received from Jesus. Did he write any of it down? This is the question that opens into darkness. The world of the 1st century was a world that valued writing. Merchants kept accounts. Officials generated documents. Philosophers wrote letters and treatises. The Jewish tradition that Jesus and all his earliest followers came from had a profound reverence for written text, the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, the accumulated wisdom of centuries encoded in marks on parchment or papyrus. And yet the earliest disciples of Jesus left almost nothing written in their own hands. The texts we have from the New Testament were written, for the most part, decades after the events they described. They were written by people who were working from oral tradition, from earlier written sources that no longer exist, from the accumulated memories of communities that have been passing stories and sayings and events down through multiple generations. The gap between what happened and what was written is enormous. It is a gap across which much may have been lost. For Andrew specifically, the question of what was lost takes on a particular sharpness. Because there is a text that exists, a text that was known in the ancient world and that has survived, at least partially, into our own time, that claims to preserve traditions about Andrew. It is called the Acts of Andrew. The Acts of Andrew is a fascinating and complex document. It belongs to a category of early Christian writing sometimes called the Apocryphal Acts, a collection of texts that describe the missionary journeys and adventures of individual apostles in ways that were enormously popular in the early church but were not accepted as authoritative scripture. There are apocryphal Acts of Peter, Acts of Paul, Acts of Thomas, Acts of John, and Acts of Andrew. These texts were not fringe documents read only by eccentrics and heretics. They were widely circulated. They were read in churches and monasteries for centuries. The great church father Eusebius mentions them, sometimes approvingly, sometimes with reservations. They shaped the popular understanding of the apostles for generations of believers who had no access to modern critical scholarship and who experienced the lives of the apostles primarily through these vivid narrative accounts. The Acts of Andrew describes a ministry of remarkable scope. It tells of miracles performed in various cities. It tells of conflicts with Roman authorities. It tells of communities of believers formed and sustained through extraordinary hardship. And it tells, with particular dramatic intensity, of Andrew's final confrontation with the Roman proconsul Aegiates in Patras, Greece, and his death on a cross. But scholars who have studied the Acts of Andrew closely have noticed something important. the text we have is not complete. Large portions of it are missing. What survives exists in multiple versions that differ from each other in significant ways, suggesting that the original text was much longer and much more detailed than anything that has come down to us. Some scholars believe the original Acts of Andrew may have been one of the longest of all the apocryphal Acts. Some estimates suggest the original text may have been comparable in length to the entire canonical Gospel of Luke. If that estimate is correct, then a very large amount of material about Andrew has been lost. The question is whether that material contained traditions that went back to genuine historical memory, to stories about Andrew that had circulated in the earliest communities of believers before they were gathered into this later narrative form. The answer is, almost certainly, yes. Oral tradition works in ways that are different from written transmission but not necessarily less reliable in certain respects. A community that has been telling a story for 2 or 3 generations develops characteristic features, repeated phrases, stable narrative structures, that allow the core content of the story to persist even as surface details shift. The stories about Andrew that eventually made their way into the Acts of Andrew almost certainly incorporated traditions about him that were very old, that had been preserved in communities in Greece and Asia Minor and perhaps elsewhere, communities that had their own reasons to remember Andrew and to keep his memory alive. Those traditions described a man of extraordinary courage and extraordinary faith. A man who traveled to the edges of the known world. A man who stood before governors and argued for his life and his beliefs. A man who was not afraid. And yet, for reasons that historians have debated for centuries, the memories that those communities preserved about Andrew were never incorporated into the canonical texts that became the Christian Bible. They circulated in a parallel stream. They were preserved in texts that the Church eventually decided were not authoritative. They lived in the popular memory of believers who found in them a vivid and inspiring account of what it meant to follow Jesus to the ends of the earth. And then, gradually, they faded. The process by which some early Christian writings were accepted as canonical scripture and others were not is one of the most complex and consequential decisions in the history of human thought. It was not a single decision made at a single moment. It was a gradual process that unfolded over several centuries, shaped by debates about authority and authenticity, by the practical needs of communities that needed clear guidance about which texts could be read in worship, by the pressures of theological controversy that made some texts more useful than others. By the end of the 4th century, the broad outlines of the Christian biblical canon were established. The 4 Gospels we know today. The letters of Paul. The Acts of the Apostles as written by Luke. Various other letters and the Book of Revelation. These texts had been read, debated, defended, and ultimately accepted as the authoritative record of the faith. Andrew does not loom large in any of them. His name appears in the lists of the 12. He appears briefly in the account of the feeding of the 5,000, where he mentions the boy with the loaves and fishes. He appears with a group of disciples who come to Jesus with a question about the temple. He appears again when some Greeks come looking for Jesus and approach Philip, who goes to tell Andrew, and together they bring the message to Jesus. These are not nothing. They are glimpses of a man who was present, engaged, involved. But they are fragments. They tell us almost nothing about who Andrew was, what he thought, how he understood what he was witnessing, what he taught, what he experienced after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Compare this to the treatment of Peter, or Paul, or John. These figures have entire books devoted to them within the New Testament. Peter speaks at length in the Acts of the Apostles. 2 letters bear his name. His role in the early church is described in considerable detail. John appears throughout the gospel that bears his name and through the letters attributed to him. Paul's letters alone constitute a substantial theological library, a passionate and intellectually remarkable record of one man's encounter with the risen Christ and his effort to understand and communicate what that encounter meant. Andrew has none of this. Why? One explanation that scholars have offered is essentially geographical. The canonical texts of the New Testament were gathered, edited, and given their authoritative status primarily in communities associated with the great cities of the Mediterranean world. Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Corinth. These were centers of population and power, cities where the early church had established strong communities with the resources to preserve and transmit written texts. Andrew's ministry, according to the ancient traditions, was largely elsewhere. In Greece, certainly, but in regions of Greece that were not the great centers of early Christian authority. In Asia Minor, but again, in areas that were peripheral to the main streams of influence. In Scythia, which was as far from the centers of early Christian literary culture as it was possible to get. The churches that remembered Andrew, that told stories about him, that preserved traditions about his ministry and his teachings, were not, by and large, the churches that shaped the canonical decisions about which texts were authoritative. They were communities on the edges, communities that contributed to the broad expansion of Christianity across the ancient world but that did not have the institutional power to ensure that their particular traditions were preserved in the texts that would eventually be accepted everywhere. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the history of early Christianity. The stories that survived are largely the stories that were useful to the communities that had the power to preserve and transmit them. The stories that were lost are often the stories of people and places and traditions that were marginal to those power centers. Andrew, the first disciple, the man who was there before anyone else, found himself, by the accident of geography and history, on the wrong side of that process. But his story did not disappear entirely. It was carried in traditions that persisted for centuries in the Eastern world, in communities stretching from Greece to the Black Sea coast, in the Orthodox churches that developed a very different understanding of Andrew's importance than the Western Church had. And it was carried, most powerfully and most persistently, in the memory of what he did in his last days in Patras. The city of Patras sits at the northwestern corner of the Peloponnese, the great peninsula that forms the southern part of mainland Greece. In the ancient world, it was an important Roman city, a port and administrative center that sat at the entrance to the Gulf of Corinth. Ships traveling between the eastern and western Mediterranean passed through these waters. The city was prosperous, cosmopolitan, full of the diverse mix of peoples and religions and philosophies that characterized Roman cities in the Eastern Empire. According to traditions preserved in multiple ancient sources, Andrew came to Patras and began to preach there. He gathered a community of believers. He performed miracles. He won converts from across the social spectrum of the city. And he attracted the attention of the man who had the power to destroy him. Aegiates, or Aegiatus in some sources, was the Roman proconsul of the province of Achaia, which included the region of Patras. He was, by the accounts we have, a man of the kind that the Roman system reliably produced in positions of provincial authority, competent, ruthless, certain of his own importance, and deeply hostile to anything that threatened the established order. Andrew's preaching threatened the established order in multiple ways. It attracted large crowds. It converted important people. It challenged the religious and social norms that held Roman provincial society together. And, according to some accounts, it had a particular impact on the household of Aegiates himself. The tradition here is specific and emotionally charged. The wife of Aegiates, a woman named Maximilla, became a follower of Andrew. She was converted by his teaching and his example. She refused, as a consequence, to continue fulfilling the marital obligations that Roman society demanded of a wife toward her husband. This detail matters because it shows Andrew's ministry reaching into the most intimate spaces of the Roman social order. He was not simply gathering the poor and the marginal. He was transforming the households of the powerful. He was challenging the foundations of the world that Rome had built. For Aegiates, this was unforgivable. Andrew was arrested. The accounts we have of the dialogue between Andrew and Aegiates are among the most remarkable passages in all of early Christian literature. They preserve, or claim to preserve, extended conversations between the apostle and the proconsul in which Andrew defends his faith, explains his beliefs, and refuses absolutely to recant or compromise in order to save his life. Whether these accounts preserve genuine historical memory or whether they are later dramatic elaborations of a tradition that was much simpler in its origins, they capture something that feels true about the character of a man who had followed Jesus since the beginning. They describe a person who had seen too much, who had experienced too much, who was too certain of what he knew, to be frightened by the threat of death. Egiates ordered that Andrew be crucified. And here the story arrives at its most powerful and most enduring moment. Andrew, according to the tradition, saw the cross on which he was to die and addressed it directly. He spoke to it as if it were a living thing, as if it were something he had long been waiting to meet. He said, "I have long desired and sought this day." He asked that he not be crucified in the same way as Jesus. Not because he was afraid, but because he did not feel worthy to die in precisely the same manner as his teacher. He was not the master. He was the first disciple. The distinction mattered to him. And so they tied him to a cross shaped like an X. Not nailed, but bound, so that the death would be slower, so that the proconsul might have more time to break him, to hear a plea for mercy, to gain the satisfaction of a recantation. It never came. Andrew hung on the cross for 2 days, according to the ancient accounts. For 2 days he continued to teach. People gathered around him, horrified and moved and unable to leave. He spoke to them from the cross with a clarity and a peace that those who heard him could not afterward explain or forget. He spoke about what he had seen. He spoke about what he believed. He spoke about what waited beyond the death that was coming for him. And he did not ask to be taken down. When Egiates, reportedly moved by the pressure of the crowd and perhaps by something he himself could not name, finally ordered that Andrew be removed from the cross, Andrew refused. He prayed that he would not be taken down. He said, "Do not deprive me of this hope." He died on the cross in Patras, Greece. Tradition holds that a great light surrounded him at the moment of his death. His name was given to the cross on which he died. The X-shaped cross is still called, in every language in which the tradition has been preserved, the Cross of St. Andrew. It is the national symbol of Scotland, for reasons that involve a tradition, reaching back to the 8th century, that some of Andrew's relics were brought to what is now the city of St. Andrews on the eastern coast of Scotland. The white X-shaped cross on a blue background is the flag of Scotland, carried on ships and in parliaments and at sporting events around the world. A man who died in a Roman provincial city 2,000 years ago, whose story was never fully gathered into the texts that the Church declared authoritative, whose teachings were never collected into a single written record, whose journeys took him to the edges of the world as Rome knew it, is remembered today in the flag of a nation on the other side of the world from where he lived and died. History is strange and deep and full of surprises. But the question that Andrew's story raises is not simply about what we know. It is about what we have lost. Because everything the ancient sources tell us about Andrew suggests that he was a man of enormous spiritual depth and practical courage. He was the first. He was present at the beginning. He traveled further than almost any of the other apostles. He established communities of believers in regions that no one else was reaching. He died for his faith with a peace and a certainty that, by all accounts, moved even his enemies. A person like that leaves traces. A person like that shapes the communities he touches in ways that persist for generations. The stories they tell about him, the things they remember him saying, the accounts they pass down of what he did, these things do not simply vanish. They circulate. They accumulate. They find their way into texts and traditions. Some of those texts and traditions survive. The Acts of Andrew, however fragmentary, is a witness to a tradition that was alive in the ancient world, that preserved memories of Andrew across the regions where his name was remembered and revered. The references in Origen and Eusebius and other early church historians point to a body of tradition about Andrew that was known and valued in the early centuries of the church. But much has been lost. The manuscript traditions of antiquity were extraordinarily fragile. Books were written by hand, one copy at a time, on materials that decayed in heat and moisture, that burned in fires, that were destroyed by the violence that periodically swept through the ancient world. Libraries were lost. Monasteries were burned. Archives were scattered and forgotten. The texts that survived are not the texts that were necessarily most important or most reliable. They are the texts that happened, by chance and circumstance, to be copied and preserved by communities that survived long enough to do the copying and had the resources to do the preserving. What did not survive is incalculable. Among the things that did not survive, historians have reason to believe, are traditions about Andrew that once circulated in the communities he founded. Stories told by people who had heard from people who had seen him. Accounts of his teaching in Scythia, in the lands around the Black Sea, in the Greek cities of Asia Minor, in the communities that lined the shores of the Aegean. Memories of what it was like to hear this man speak, this man who had known Jesus personally, who had walked with him, who had heard him teach, who had seen what no one else in human history had seen. Those memories were the most valuable thing those communities possessed. They were worth more than gold. They were more important than property or status or any of the other things that the Roman world valued. They were the living connection to a moment that had changed everything. And yet they are gone. Or perhaps they are not entirely gone. Perhaps they persist in fragments, scattered across texts that have not yet been fully analyzed or understood. Perhaps they wait in manuscript collections that have not yet been fully explored, in archives and monastery libraries in Greece or Turkey or Russia or Egypt. Perhaps new discoveries will yet add to what we know. The history of biblical scholarship is a history of unexpected discoveries. The Dead Sea Scrolls, found in caves near the Dead Sea in the 1940s and 1950s, transformed our understanding of the Jewish world from which Christianity emerged. The Nag Hammadi Library, a collection of Coptic texts found in Egypt in 1945, revealed a rich and varied landscape of early Christian thought that had been almost entirely unknown to modern scholarship. Every decade brings new studies, new translations, new analyses of texts that had been overlooked or misunderstood. Perhaps somewhere in that landscape of discovery, there waits a text that will change what we know about Andrew. Perhaps not. Perhaps the silence is permanent. Perhaps what has been lost is truly lost, and the gap in the record is something that no future discovery will fill. But either way, the question of Andrew matters. It matters because he was the first. It matters because his story is the story of what it looks like to give up everything for something you believe in without reservation. It matters because his journeys trace the outer limits of the early Christian expansion, the lonely reaches of the ancient world where the message of Jesus arrived in the hands of a man from Galilee who had nothing to offer but his own testimony. It matters because the silence around him is itself a kind of testimony to how history works, to how the stories that shape us are not necessarily the stories that were most important but the stories that survived the random cruelties of time and circumstance. And it matters because in that silence, in that absence, there is something that asks to be heard. The world that Andrew moved through after the death and resurrection of Jesus was a world in rapid, violent, confusing transformation. The Jerusalem that he had known, the city where Jesus had died and where the first community of believers had gathered, was torn apart by war in the year 70 when the Roman armies of Titus besieged and destroyed the Second Temple, killing tens of thousands and scattering the Jewish population across the empire. The catastrophe of 70 transformed everything. It ended the world of temple-centered Judaism. It forced the nascent Christian community to define itself in new ways, to separate itself from the religious matrix out of which it had grown. Andrew, if the traditions are correct, was already far from Jerusalem when this happened. He was in the eastern Mediterranean, in Greece, in regions far from the center of the Jewish world. He was building something in places where no one had yet heard of Jesus, among people who had no reason to know what had happened in that distant province of Judea. This meant that the communities Andrew founded were, from the beginning, different in character from the communities in Jerusalem or Antioch or Corinth. They were further from the sources of tradition. They were more exposed to the influence of the surrounding Hellenistic culture. They were more dependent on the oral memories of a single founding figure and less connected to the rich written tradition that the Jerusalem community possessed. When Andrew died, those communities were left to preserve what they had received from him as best they could. Some of them did remarkably well. The tradition that Andrew founded the church in Byzantium, the city that would become Constantinople and eventually Istanbul, was preserved with extraordinary tenacity through the centuries of the Byzantine Empire. It became the foundation of the claim by the Patriarchate of Constantinople to a special authority in Eastern Christianity, a claim that has persisted through schism and conquest and historical upheaval to the present day. The name of Andrew has been invoked in some of the most consequential theological and political disputes in Christian history precisely because his legacy was understood to be foundational for the Eastern Church in a way that Peter's legacy was foundational for the Western Church. This parallel is remarkable. The two brothers from Bethsaida, the fishermen's sons who left their nets on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, became the symbolic founders of the two great streams of the Christian tradition. Peter's legacy anchored the Roman Church. Andrew's legacy anchored the Eastern Church. But Peter's legacy was backed by an enormous weight of written testimony. Letters, Gospels, histories, theological treatises, all of these repeatedly invoked and elaborated and gave substance to Peter's central role in the story of early Christianity. Andrew's legacy was backed primarily by tradition. By oral memory. By the veneration of communities that preserved his name and his story not in carefully copied manuscripts but in liturgical practice, in the naming of churches, in the telling and retelling of stories around which a common identity formed. When that oral tradition was eventually written down, as in the Acts of Andrew, it was written down in a form that the guardians of canonical authority found problematic. Too miraculous. Too focused on miracles and dramatic confrontations and not enough on the theological core of the Christian message. Too similar, in some ways, to the pagan novels and adventure stories that circulated through the same cultural world. And so the written version of Andrew's tradition was denied the authority that would have ensured its survival. What survives instead is fragments. The incomplete Acts. The references in ancient historians. The liturgical traditions of the Eastern Church. The legend of St. Andrew in Scotland. The white cross on the blue flag. And the question that cannot be answered but will not go away. What did Andrew know that was never written down? He was, remember, the first. He was there before Peter. He was there before John. He was there at the very beginning of the story, in the days before anything had been decided, before the community of followers had taken any definite shape, before the theological categories that would later define Christianity had been developed. He heard Jesus teach in those earliest days. He was present for the first miracles. He watched as the crowds began to gather, as the reputation of Jesus spread through the villages of Galilee, as the opposition began to form among the religious authorities who understood, even before the disciples themselves fully understood, that something potentially revolutionary was happening. He was present, according to the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law. He was present for the early preaching in the synagogues. He was there. And what he saw and heard and understood in those earliest days, before the story had been told so many times that it had settled into fixed forms, before the theological weight of the resurrection had reshaped everything that came before it, might have been very different from the accounts that were eventually written down by people who came later and who were trying to make sense of something that had already been filtered through decades of communal memory and theological reflection. The raw experience of those early days with Jesus, the daily reality of walking with him and listening to him and watching him, the small moments that never made it into any of the official accounts because they seemed too ordinary or too private or too specific to the experience of one individual, all of that lived inside Andrew. And all of that, with him, is gone. Unless some fragment of it survived. Unless some community, somewhere, preserved something that he said or did or taught that has not yet been fully recognized for what it is. Unless somewhere in the vast landscape of ancient Christian literature, in texts that have been misidentified or misattributed or simply not yet adequately studied, there waits something that carries the signature of Andrew's tradition. This is not an impossible hope. History has repeatedly surprised us with what it turns out to have preserved. The Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus, was unknown to modern scholarship until its discovery at Nag Hammadi. When it was analyzed, scholars found that some of the material it contained appeared to preserve very early traditions that might go back to the same period and the same circles as the materials used by the canonical Gospel writers. The discovery did not change the canonical status of the Gospel of Thomas, but it expanded enormously what we know about the diversity and richness of the early Christian tradition. Similar discoveries have come from other parts of the ancient world. Fragments found in Egyptian rubbish heaps. Texts preserved in Ethiopian or Armenian or Coptic manuscripts that had never been translated into Western languages. Inscriptions on the walls of ancient buildings. Fragments of papyrus that had survived in dry desert conditions for 2,000 years. Each of these discoveries has added something, however small, to what we know about the world from which Christianity emerged and the diversity of the traditions that formed within it. Could something similar be waiting for Andrew? The regions where his ministry was most active, Greece, Turkey, Ukraine, are regions with long histories of manuscript preservation and only partially explored archives. The monasteries of Mount Athos in Greece, among the most significant repositories of ancient Christian manuscripts in the world, have never been fully catalogued or published. The libraries of Eastern Orthodox monasteries in Romania and Russia and Georgia contain texts that have not been systematically studied by Western scholars. The archaeological sites of ancient cities along the Black Sea coast continue to yield new evidence about the communities that lived there in the early centuries of the Common Era. Somewhere in that landscape, it is not unreasonable to imagine, something waits. But the waiting has gone on for a very long time. And in the meantime, we are left with what we have. We have the silence of the canonical Gospels, which give us glimpses of a man who was always present but rarely at the center of things. We have the fragments of the Acts of Andrew, which preserve traditions that are dramatically vivid and historically uncertain in equal measure. We have the testimonies of ancient historians who mention Andrew's missionary work in terms that suggest a much larger story behind the few sentences they give us. We have the traditions of Eastern Christianity, which have preserved his name and his legacy with a devotion that speaks to how deeply his memory mattered to the communities he touched. And we have the flag of Scotland, which carries, in its simple white X on a field of blue, the sign of a cross on which a fisherman from Galilee died in a Roman provincial city on the western coast of Greece 2,000 years ago. This is what history has preserved of Andrew. It is something. It is more than nothing. But it is far less than what there was. The fragility of ancient tradition is one of the most humbling things that a person can contemplate. We live in a world that has been shaped, in the most fundamental ways, by events that took place 2,000 years ago, events that were experienced by specific individuals in specific places, events that were then transmitted to the rest of humanity through a chain of human memory and human effort that at every link was vulnerable to the accidents of time. Most of what was said in the ancient world is gone. Most of what was written is gone. Most of what was thought and felt and experienced by the billions of human beings who lived before us has vanished without a trace. What survives is not necessarily what was most important. It is what happened, by a combination of luck and care and sometimes deliberate effort, to be preserved. A community that survived a plague. A monastery that was not burned in a war. A manuscript that happened to end up in a collection that a scholar 2 centuries later happened to notice. The history of human thought is preserved in a series of near misses and narrow escapes from oblivion. Andrew's story is one of the near misses that did not quite escape. Enough survived to know that he mattered. Enough survived to trace the outline of a life that was extraordinary by any measure. Enough survived to feel the weight of what is missing, to sense the shape of the absence where his voice should be. But not enough survived to hear that voice. Not enough survived to know what he thought as he walked with Jesus through the hills of Galilee in those first extraordinary days. Not enough survived to hear him describe what he saw. Not enough survived to give us his theology, his understanding of what the death and resurrection of Jesus meant, his interpretation of the teachings he had received from the very first days. Not enough survived to give us Andrew as he really was, in the full complexity and depth of a human being who had experienced something that no one had experienced before and that changed him utterly and that he spent the rest of his life trying to communicate to the world. What we have instead is a silhouette. A presence suggested by absences. A name that stands at the beginning of everything and then fades into the background of the story that everyone else is telling. It is not enough. But it is what we have. And in a certain light, the silence itself is eloquent. The gap in the record is a testimony to the nature of history, to the selectivity of what gets preserved and what gets lost, to the contingency of everything we think we know about the past. It is a reminder that the stories that have come down to us are not the only stories that existed. They are the stories that survived. And the stories that survived are not the whole story. Andrew was the first. He was there at the beginning. He was the bridge that brought Peter into the story, the catalyst for everything that followed. He traveled to the edges of the known world. He died on a cross in a Roman city, bound in the shape of an X, asking not to be taken down, saying that he had long desired this day. His name is on a flag. His memory is in the prayers of Orthodox Christians across the Eastern world. His tradition, however fragmented and however incomplete, has outlasted the empire that killed him and the institutions that failed to fully preserve it. Something of Andrew has survived. But somewhere, in the immense and largely silent landscape of what was lost, there is a story that we have not heard. A voice that has not spoken. A gospel that was never written down, or was written down and then lost, or was lost before it was written down and now exists only in the absence that it left behind. The lost gospel of Andrew. Not a specific text. Not a manuscript hidden in a cave or locked in a monastery. But the accumulated testimony of a life that was present at the beginning of everything, that witnessed things that no one else witnessed in quite the same way, that carried a tradition into the most distant corners of the ancient world and left something there that was alive and vital and then, slowly, imperceptibly, faded into silence. That is what was lost. That is what we are still, in some sense, looking for. Not necessarily a physical object. Not necessarily a parchment or a papyrus or a codex. But a completeness. A fullness. The sense that the story has been told as fully as it could be told, that the first disciple has been given the hearing that the first disciple deserved. We do not have that. What we have instead is a question. A question that has been asked for centuries, by every reader who noticed the silence and felt the weight of it. A question that may never be answered. But it is a question worth asking. Because in the asking of it, in the willingness to notice the absence and to refuse to be satisfied with the silence, there is a kind of fidelity to the man who was there first. A recognition that he mattered. That his story mattered. That the first disciple deserved more than a footnote in the account of what everyone else was doing. His name was Andrew. He was the first. Sometimes the most important people in a story are the ones we barely notice at first. History has a strange way of remembering certain voices while letting others fade into the background. And when you start paying attention to those quieter figures, the ones who stood close to the center but rarely spoke, you begin to realize how much of the story might still be hidden between the lines. And somewhere in the silence that surrounds his story, the echo of something extraordinary waits to be heard. The tradition that remembers Andrew most vividly is the tradition of the Eastern churches, the Orthodox communities that trace their origins, in various ways, to the regions where Andrew's ministry was most active. In the Orthodox world, Andrew is not a minor figure. He is not the forgotten apostle, the brother in the background while Peter takes center stage. He is the Protokletos, the first called, the one who heard the call of Jesus before anyone else and responded before anyone else had the courage to do so. This different understanding of Andrew is not simply a matter of institutional politics, though it is partly that. It reflects something deeper, a different way of reading the gospel story, a different set of priorities about which moments and which figures deserve to be remembered. The Western Church, centered on Rome, naturally elevated Peter because Peter was understood to be the founder of the Roman Church, the first bishop, the rock on which the institution was built. The figure of Peter served the institutional needs of the Western Church in ways that the figure of Andrew, whose ministry was in the East, in regions that were not central to the development of Western Christianity, could not serve. The Eastern Church had different institutional needs and different theological emphases. The tradition of Andrew as founder of the church in Constantinople served the Patriarchate's claims to authority. The emphasis on Andrew as the first called reflected an Eastern theological preference for the contemplative, the mystical, the personal encounter with the divine, rather than the institutional and hierarchical emphases that characterized Western Christianity. Both traditions are responding to the same historical figure. Both are trying to make sense of the same evidence. But they make sense of it in very different ways, and those different ways of making sense of Andrew reflect the deep differences between the two great streams of the Christian tradition. This is one reason why Andrew matters to historians and theologians beyond his direct significance in the Gospel narratives. He is a figure at which the divergent emphases of Eastern and Western Christianity become visible. He is a mirror in which two very different ways of being Christian can be seen side by side. The Andrew of the Eastern tradition is a spiritual pioneer, a contemplative and a mystic who carried the inner life of his encounter with Jesus into the furthest reaches of the ancient world. The Andrew of the Western tradition, to the extent that he appears at all, is a subordinate figure, the brother who pointed Peter toward Jesus and then stepped aside. Neither of these is simply wrong. Neither is simply right. They are different facets of a figure who was large enough and complex enough to sustain multiple traditions and multiple ways of being remembered. And in between them, in the gap between the Eastern Andrew and the Western Andrew, there is still something that neither tradition has fully captured. The real Andrew. The man who stood on the shore of the Sea of Galilee and pulled nets from the water and heard his name called by a voice unlike any he had ever heard. The man who walked away from everything he knew to follow a teacher whose teaching he did not yet fully understand. The man who traveled to the ends of the world, who faced death with a peace that astonished his executioners, who died on a cross asking not to be taken down. That man is partly visible in the fragments that survive. But he is mostly still hidden. Mostly still silent. Mostly still waiting. The silence around Andrew is not the silence of insignificance. It is the silence of something enormous that has not yet found its full expression. It is the silence of the ocean before the wave, the silence of the deep before the word. In the beginning was the Word. And before the Word was spoken in the form that the world would hear it, before the Gospels were written and the letters of Paul were sent and the councils gathered to define the faith, there was a man on a shore who heard something and followed. That man was Andrew. And his story, the full story, the story that was lived in all its completeness before history did what history does to most of what is most important, is still, after 2,000 years, waiting to be told. We may never hear it. But we should know that it existed. We should know that the silence around the first disciple is not the natural silence of someone who had little to say or little to do, but the silence left behind by a voice that once spoke and a life that once burned with extraordinary purpose and that has been, by the accidents and violences of time, only partially and inadequately preserved. That knowledge changes how we read the gospel story. It changes how we think about the first disciples. It changes how we understand the formation of the tradition that became Christianity. It opens up the story, makes it larger and more complex and more mysterious than the officially preserved version alone can convey. And it honors Andrew. Not with the honoring of monuments and liturgies, though those too have their place. But with the honoring of attention. The honoring of the question that refuses to be satisfied with the silence. The honoring of a man who was the first to follow, and whose story, for all the accidents of preservation and the selectivity of tradition, has not yet been fully told. His name was Andrew. He was the first. And somewhere in the distance between what happened and what was preserved, between what he knew and what we know, between the shore of the Sea of Galilee and the cross in Patras and the flag of Scotland and all the places his name has been carried across 2,000 years of human history, there is still something waiting. The lost gospel of the first disciple. We are still looking for it. And perhaps, in the asking, we are already beginning to hear it. This is the story of Andrew the Apostle. The first called. The first to follow. The first to declare what he believed. The man who brought his brother to Jesus and then stepped back into the shadows of the gospel narrative, not because his story was small, but because the preservation of great stories is never simply a matter of their greatness. His cross is on a flag. His name is in the prayers of millions. His tradition reaches from the shores of Galilee to the shores of the Black Sea to the shores of the North Sea. And his full story, the story he carried in himself and that died with him on the cross in Patras, is still, after all these centuries, the most important story about early Christianity that has never been fully told. Remember his name. Ask the question. Feel the weight of the silence. And know that the first disciple was not forgotten by history. He was simply lost in it. Like so much of what matters most. Like so much of what was real. Like the voice that spoke before the writing began, and the life that was lived before the record was made, and the truth that was known before the tradition had finished deciding what the truth was allowed to be. Andrew was there first. And his story is still, in the most important sense, waiting to begin. If you have found something in this story that moved you, that made you think, that opened a question you had not asked before, then consider sharing it with someone who might feel the same thing. The stories of the hidden figures of history, the people who were present at the most important moments and whose voices have been only partially preserved, deserve to be heard and considered and passed on. Because that is, in the end, what Andrew himself was doing. Passing on a story he had received. Carrying a tradition forward into places where it had not yet arrived. Trusting that what he had heard and seen and believed was worth the cost of a journey to the edge of the world. He was right. And somewhere in the silence that surrounds his name, the echo of that rightness still sounds. This has been the story of the lost gospel of Andrew. The first disciple. The hidden story. The voice that spoke before the record began. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to the pioneer. It is different from the loneliness of the outcast, who is excluded against his will. It is different from the loneliness of the hermit, who chooses solitude as a spiritual discipline. It is the loneliness of the person who has arrived somewhere before anyone else, who stands at a threshold that others will eventually cross in great numbers, but who crosses it alone, in the dark, without the comfort of knowing that the path leads anywhere at all. Andrew knew this loneliness. He knew it in the days before Jesus, when he walked into the desert to find John the Baptist and left behind the world of the fishing village and the family boat and the familiar rhythms of a life organized around the seasons and the water. That walk into the desert was not a certain thing. It was a leap into something unmapped. He went because something in him could not stay. Because the questions that the Baptist's preaching raised were questions he had already been carrying and could no longer ignore. He knew it again in those first days of following Jesus, when the path of what was happening had not yet become clear, when Jesus was still a figure whose significance was intuited rather than understood, when every morning brought new encounters and new teachings that opened the world in ways that nothing in Andrew's previous experience had prepared him for. The other disciples, as they joined the group one by one, arrived into something that was already forming. They arrived into a community that had begun to take shape, into a tradition that was already being assembled through the shared experience of those who had been there longer. They had companions in their disorientation. They had older members who had seen more and could provide a context for what was happening. Andrew had none of this. He was first. And being first means being alone in the way that only the first can be alone. Historians who study the social dynamics of religious movements have noted how this quality of being first shapes a person's relationship to the tradition they help to found. The first followers are different from all subsequent followers in a way that is impossible to fully communicate. They carry something in their memories and their bodies that no later account can fully capture, a direct, unmediated experience of the founding moment that is intrinsically personal and intrinsically unrepeatable. What did Andrew carry in himself from those first days? He carried the memory of a specific afternoon. The account in John's Gospel places it precisely, a meeting at a specific time, and then following Jesus to where he was staying, and sitting with him through the hours that followed. He carried the memory of what was said in those hours, the questions he asked and the answers he received, the quality of the attention that Jesus gave him, the way the room felt, the light, the sounds from outside. These specific, embodied, sensory memories are the most irreplaceable things that any witness to a significant event possesses. They are also the things that are most resistant to being transmitted in language, because language necessarily generalizes and abstracts, while memory is particular and concrete. Andrew could have described that afternoon to everyone he ever met. He probably did. But each description would have been an imperfect translation of what he remembered into words that could only gesture toward the reality of the experience. And each person who heard his description would have received only the words, not the experience itself. This is the fundamental problem of transmission. This is why the earliest communities of followers were so desperate to hold on to the people who had been there, to keep them alive, to press them with questions, to record their testimonies before the witnesses died and took their memories with them. Andrew lived for decades after the death and resurrection of Jesus. He spent those decades moving through the ancient world, carrying his testimony with him, describing what he had seen and heard to people who had never been anywhere near Galilee and who had no frame of reference for understanding the significance of what he was describing. In city after city, in community after community, he must have told the story of that afternoon. The story of what John the Baptist said. The story of following Jesus to where he was staying. The story of what it was like to be in his presence before anyone else had arrived. That story is gone. Not entirely, never entirely, something of it persists in the fragments and traditions that have survived. But the fullness of it, the living texture of it, the particular quality of memory that Andrew alone possessed, is gone. And this is not a small loss. This is an enormous loss. This is the loss of the most direct witness account that any human being could have offered to the beginning of one of the most consequential religious movements in human history. The strangeness of Andrew's position in the historical record becomes even more striking when you consider how it compares to other figures from the same period who left a similarly slight written legacy but whose influence on history has been incalculable. Socrates wrote nothing. Everything we know about him comes from the accounts of others, primarily Plato, but also Xenophon and Aristophanes, each of whom gave us a different Socrates shaped by their own interpretive frameworks and rhetorical purposes. The Socrates of Plato is the Socrates that most of Western philosophy has engaged with, but historians have always known that this Socrates is as much Plato's creation as a historical reconstruction. The Buddha wrote nothing. The teachings attributed to him were transmitted orally for centuries before being written down, and the different schools of Buddhism have produced very different accounts of what the Buddha actually said and meant. Jesus wrote nothing. Everything we know about him comes through the mediation of accounts written by people who did not, for the most part, know him personally, accounts shaped by the theological and practical needs of the communities in which they were written. And Andrew, one of the people who did know Jesus personally, left almost nothing that has been preserved. This is not unusual in the history of religious traditions. The foundational encounters, the direct experiences of the figures who started everything, are almost always the least well documented. The witnesses are too busy living the consequences of what they experienced to sit down and write systematic accounts of how it began. By the time the writing happens, the witnesses are gone, and what is written is already shaped by the questions and the needs of later interpreters. In Andrew's case, this process operated more completely than in some others. The communities that preserved his memory were, for reasons of geography and institutional history, less powerful than the communities that shaped the canonical record. The texts that might have carried his voice were lost or suppressed or simply allowed to fade. And the result is that the man who was first has become, in the official record, one of the most marginal of the apostles. But the marginality is in the record, not in the life. The life, as best we can reconstruct it from the fragments that survive, was anything but marginal. It was a life of extraordinary range and extraordinary courage, a life that touched communities across an enormous geographic and cultural span, a life that ended in the kind of death that marks a person as someone who believed what they said with an absolute completeness. This is the Andrew who deserves to be remembered. Not the footnote. Not the man in the background. Not the brother of the more famous disciple. But the pioneer. The first. The person who was willing to go where no one else was willing to go, and who went, and who arrived, and who died there, and whose death was, in the tradition of the communities that remembered it, something radiant. Consider the world of Eastern Greece and the regions beyond it in the 1st century. Consider what it meant to be a Jewish man from Galilee arriving in those cities and towns and trying to communicate a message that was, by any measure, extraordinary. The Greek world had its own rich philosophical and religious traditions. The great schools of philosophy, Stoicism, Epicureanism, Platonism, were all alive and active. The mystery religions offered initiates experiences of death and rebirth that were genuinely compelling to the people who participated in them. The traditional gods of the Greek pantheon still had their temples and their festivals. And there were synagogues in every significant city, communities of Jewish people maintaining their traditions in the midst of the surrounding Hellenistic culture. Into this complex and intellectually sophisticated world, Andrew arrived with a story about a man in Galilee who had been executed by the Romans and risen from the dead. By any rational calculation, this should have gone nowhere. And yet it did not go nowhere. By any measure we have access to, Andrew's preaching worked. Communities formed. People believed. The message took root in soil that had every reason to reject it. How? We cannot know, not in the detail we would need to fully understand it. But we can speculate, based on what we know about how the message spread in similar environments, about what Andrew must have had that made the difference. He had the authority of presence. He had been there. He had seen what he was describing. When he talked about Jesus, he was not transmitting a text or repeating a formula. He was describing his own direct experience, an experience that had reorganized his entire understanding of what human life was and what it was for. That quality of direct witness is something that audiences across cultures and across centuries have responded to. It is the quality that distinguishes testimony from theology, the lived from the theorized. He also had the authority of his own transformation. A man who had left behind his family, his livelihood, his home, and his culture to carry a message to the ends of the world was a man who clearly believed what he was saying. The willingness to pay that price is itself a form of argument. It says, without saying it in words, that this is real. That this matters. That the cost of following it is worth it. And he had, perhaps most importantly, the authority of a specific kind of peace. The accounts we have of Andrew in his final days describe a man who was not afraid. A man who faced the prospect of a painful and degrading death with a tranquility that made no sense by ordinary human standards. That peace is not nothing. That peace is evidence of something. Of a conviction so deep and so well-founded that it could not be shaken by the worst that the world could do. That is what Andrew carried into the cities and villages and wildernesses of the ancient world. That is what he left behind in the communities he founded. That is what those communities tried, with varying success, to preserve and transmit to those who came after. The loss of his full story is the loss of access to what that peace felt like from the inside, what it sounded like in his own voice, how he explained and transmitted and embodied it in ways that moved people who had never met Jesus and had no reason to believe what they were hearing. That is what is missing. That is what the silence in the canonical record fails to convey. In the landscapes he traveled through, in the cities of Greece and the wild territories north of the Black Sea, Andrew is not simply a historical footnote. He is, in the living memory of communities that have maintained their traditions for 2,000 years, the founder. The one who brought the word to them. The one who made them what they are. The Orthodox Christians of Greece celebrate the feast of Andrew on the 30th of November. In Patras, where he died, the celebration is among the most significant religious events of the year. The cathedral that bears his name, one of the largest in Greece, stands near the place where tradition holds that he was crucified. His relics, including what is claimed to be part of the X-shaped cross, are venerated with extraordinary devotion. In Romania, in Russia, in Georgia, in Ukraine, and across the communities of Eastern Christianity, Andrew's name is not the name of a forgotten minor figure. It is the name of a patriarch, a founder, the one who was first. And in Scotland, on the flag that flies above every public building, above stadiums and parliamentary chambers and ships, the white cross of Andrew is a symbol of national identity so deeply embedded that most people who carry it have no idea why that particular cross, in that particular shape, represents their country. The reason is a story that takes us from 1st century Patras to 8th century Scotland, a journey that is itself a testament to how Andrew's name traveled. The tradition holds that in the year 832, a Pictish king named Angus, or Angus, facing an army of Angles and Saxons that vastly outnumbered his own force, prayed to Saint Andrew and saw a vision of white clouds forming across in the blue sky. He promised that if he won the battle, he would make Andrew the patron saint of Scotland. He won. He kept his promise. Whether the story is historically accurate in its details or not is, in a certain sense, beside the point. The story has been told and retold for over 1,000 years. It has shaped a national identity. It has made a fisherman from Galilee the patron of a nation on the other side of the world from where he was born. This is what the fragments of Andrew's tradition accomplished. Without the full gospel, without the collected writings, without the canonical authority that would have ensured systematic preservation of his story. Just fragments, traditions, oral memories, the reports of ancient historians, and the devotion of communities that remembered what he had done for them. Those fragments were enough. They were enough to build a cathedral in Patras. Enough to put a cross on a flag. Enough to sustain 2,000 years of prayer and liturgy in the Eastern churches. Enough to make Andrew the subject of historical investigation, theological reflection, artistic representation, and a steady stream of books and documentaries and conversations that continue to this day. Enough, perhaps, to suggest that the full story, whatever it was extraordinary. Think about what it means that fragments were enough to accomplish all of this. If fragments, scattered and incomplete and in some cases barely coherent, were sufficient to create the tradition of devotion to Andrew that has persisted through 2 millennia, what might the full story have done? What could it do still, if it were somehow recovered? This is not an idle question. The recovery of lost texts, the rediscovery of forgotten traditions, the rehabilitation of marginalized figures from the past, these are not merely academic exercises. They change how people understand themselves and their tradition. They open new possibilities for interpretation and for meaning. They restore complexity to a story that has sometimes been simplified in ways that distort it. The recovery of Andrew's full story, even a partial recovery, even a better understanding of the traditions that once circulated about him, would change the story of early Christianity in ways that matter. It would give the Eastern churches a richer basis for their claims about Andrew's significance. It would provide a counterweight to the exclusively Western framing of Christian origins that has dominated the academic and popular understanding of the tradition. It would restore to visibility a figure whose ministry touched the lives of communities that have been on the margins of the official narrative for centuries. And it would honor the first disciple. It would give Andrew, finally, a hearing proportional to his significance. Not the significance that institutional power has assigned to him, but the significance that comes from being first, from being willing to go where no one else would go, from carrying a testimony to the ends of the earth and dying for it. He deserves that hearing. He has been waiting for it for a very long time. The cross of Andrew stands in a cathedral in Patras. It stands on the flag of Scotland. It stands in the prayers of millions of people across the Eastern world who have been invoking his name every year for 2,000 years. And it stands, silently, in the gap in the gospel record where Andrew's voice should be. That gap is not nothing. That gap is a shape. A specific shape that reveals, in its outline, the presence of something that once filled it and is no longer there. The lost gospel of Andrew. The first disciple's hidden story. The voice that spoke before the writing began. It was real. It mattered. And even in its absence, even in the silence that has replaced it, it speaks. If you listen closely enough. If you are willing to ask the question that the silence is always asking. Who was there first? Andrew was there first. And his story is still, after everything, beginning to be told. Acqui esta enseramento naturali forte para o seu video, mentendo o tom historico e reflexivo do seu rotero. And maybe that is where the real meaning of Andrew's story lies. Not in the texts that survived, but in the silence that surrounds them. Because history often preserves the voices that had power, influence, or institutions strong enough to protect their memory. But the beginnings of great movements are rarely neat or orderly. They are lived by real people, in uncertain moments, making decisions without knowing how the future will remember them. Andrew was one of those people. He stood at the very beginning. He heard the call before anyone else. He walked away from everything familiar, not knowing where the road would lead. And from the shores of Galilee to the distant cities of the ancient world, he carried a message that would outlive empires. Most of what he saw, we will never know. Most of what he said has disappeared into history. But the fact that fragments of his story survived at all tells us something important. It tells us that the people who met him never forgot him. That the communities he touched remembered the man who had been there first. And sometimes, in history, that is enough to leave a trace that lasts for thousands of years. So the next time you read the story of the first disciples, remember the name that appears quietly at the beginning. The fisherman who heard the call first. The man who brought his brother to Jesus. The disciple who stepped into the unknown before anyone else. Andrew. The first called. And perhaps, the apostle whose full story we are still trying to hear. If this story made you see the early days of Christianity a little differently, consider subscribing and sharing this video. There are many more hidden stories in history, voices that shaped the world, even when the record barely remembers them. And sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones history almost forgot.